Hi everyone. In today's session, we'll be talking about Mulligatawny Dreams, a poem written by Meena Kandasamy. This is a very important poem to be looked into in this post-colonial era. Now, let's see who is Meena Kandasamy. She is a poet, fiction writer, translator, and activist based in Chennai. Her parents named her as Illavenil, 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 when she was very young. Later, she assumed the name Meena Kandasamy when she started writing poetry. Now, she was the daughter of two academicians. Her father, a Tamil professor at Madras University, her mother, a professor of mathematics at IIT Madras. She often said her life changed when her father was seen as a troublemaker by the authorities. He even lost his job when she was just 18 days old baby. After that, her father never had a permanent job, and she grew up seeing her mother struggling hard single handedly to look after the family. She often claimed that poetry happened by accident and it has helped her come to terms with many things in life. She says, I quote, poetry is more convenient. You can work on it for a certain amount of time and then get back to it later. Unquote. That is what she mean by that is uh, she found writing poetry as an activity which consumes less time than writing a fiction. Then Meena started writing poetry at the age of 17. Her first collection, poetry collection, is titled Touch. It was published in 2006. In that, two of her poems have won prizes in all India poetry competitions. Her poetry was published in various journals, including The Little Magazine, Kavya Bharati, Indian Horizons, Muse India, and the Quarterly Literary Review, Singapore, etc. Then she has entitled her first collection as Touch because it is the most elementary of all sensations which a human being has bestowed with. Even when in a meditation, a religious man closes his eyes, ears, and nose. It is the sense of touch which keeps him connected with this world. This feeling of touch is perhaps the first of senses, and no one can get rid of it. So, the same feeling of touch is thought to be a taboo when it tries to transgress the compartmentalization of caste. So, the atrocities of the past and present are transformed to the readers of the present to make them aware of the realities faced by the depressed people and preserved for the future. So, it is a devotion for which Dalits die. So, according to Meena Kandasamy, caste is crueler than disease and it is emotionless and dry. Then, her another collection is Miss Militancy. It was published in 2010. She adopts an outcast and feminist lens to retell Hindu and Tamil myths through this collection. Other works such as Mascara and My Lover Speaks of Rape won her the first prize in All India Poetry Competition. So, when people criticized her poetry for its language and theme, she said, I quote, my poetry is naked. My poetry is in tears. My poetry screams in anger. My poetry writhes in pain. My poetry smells of blood. My poetry salutes sacrifice. My poetry speaks like my people. My poetry speaks for my people. Unquote. So, this is why she wrote poetry. And besides that, she is one of the 21 short fiction writers from South Asia featured in an anthology published by Zuban, New Delhi. Okay, then coming to her fictional works, The Gypsy Goddess, which was published in 2014, was her first novel. It is a stunning account of the murder of 44 low caste laborers and their families in a Tamil village, Kilvanmani, in Tanjore in 1968. The workers, striking for better pay and conditions, were locked in a hut and burned alive. And this was a deeply faithful account of the reality which happened in 1968. And then let's talk about her second novel, When I Hit You, the portrait of the writer as a young wife. This was published in 2017. It was an intermingling of the political and domestic that drove her to write it. She was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018. In 2011, she was married briefly for about 4 months to a man who subjected her to physical and psychological violence. And it was a representation of her own story, but she anonymized the narrator of When I Hit You to universalize the experience. And she had learned that being feminist, outspoken, successful, and loud was no protection against violence. So, this book was driven by a desire for social justice. And the end of her first marriage in 2011 inspired her to write this novel. And later, she met her current partner in 2013 and came to the UK in 2016, where she still lives. And often, when someone asks her about her family, she said, uh, like this, I quote, "One of my sons is British, the other is American, my partner is Belgian, I'm an Indian. This is the new family." Unquote. This is how she talked about her family, which is casteless. Okay. Now, next, let's talk about Exquisite Cadavers, which was published in 2019. It is an experimental work that fuses reality and fiction. And this novel has a new style in which she wrote two narrations parallelly. One side, fiction is there on one side of the page, and fact on the other side, with slightly a smaller font. In this, she addresses contemporary issues such as metro, immigration, sexual violence, film criticism, the damage families do to each other, selfhood, and the relationship between the individual and history. Not only that, this book is a reaction to the response to her previous novel, When I Hit You, as the reviewer called it a memoir. She writes, I quote, "The reception enforced my perception that to a Western audience, writers like me are interesting because we are from a place where horrible things happen, or horrible things have happened to us, or a combination of the above. No one discusses process with us. No one treats us as writers, only as diarists who survived." So this is how a Western audience see writers like Kandasamy. This is what she thinks. Now, her non-fiction works include Cast in the City of Nine Gates, which she started working on it in 2013, but it's not completed yet. And the other work is Ayyangali, a Dalit leader of organic protest, which she co-authored in 2007. And besides that, she edited The Dalit, a bi monthly alternative English magazine of the Dalit Media Network from 2001 to 2002. Actually, she did all these works in her 20s. That is a very amazing fact about her. Then she is a translator, as I said earlier. Her translations include the writings and speeches of Tirumavalavan, leader of the Dalit Panthers of India. He was the member of parliament in the 15th Lok Sabha, and his political platform centers on ending the caste based oppression of the Dalit. and currently he is the president of the Viduthalai Chirutaigal Kachi Party. Okay, and then she also translated the poetry and fables of Tamil Elam poet. You know that the Tamils, Sri Lankan Tamilians. Okay, they are called as Elam outside Tamil speaking area. Okay, so that is Elam poet Kashi Anandan and the works of Periyar E.V. Ramaswamy. He is known as the father of the Dravidian movement, and he did notable work against Brahmanical dominance and gender and caste inequality in Tamil Nadu. Besides that, she holds a PhD in sociolinguistics. She voiced about various political issues relating to caste, corruption, violence, and women's rights in her works. According to her, the politics of her poetry is that she says, caste system in society is wounding itself. She enumerates the other ways in which society wounds itself with domestic violence, with child sexual abuse, then with the hatred around us. For that, she says like this. I quote: "These are all the things that needs healing." Unquote. All the things which she mentioned is domestic violence, child sexual abuse, and hatred around us, or in short, caste system. And as a writer, her focus was mainly on caste annihilation, feminism, and linguistic identity. Yeah. Then, when we talk about Kandasami's poems in general, she portrays a dreadful picture of varied agonies experienced by Dalits, and her poems seem as an encyclopedia of painful inventories. You could see things like this, that untouchable turns into touchable for upper caste when it fits their selfish deeds and lusty demands. Yeah, it is the food and water, the most precious commodities for which a Dalit has to struggle the most. So in her poetry, you could find the pain or the agonies or the struggles encountered by them in their real life. Ironically, she says it is the poor low caste who produces food grains, and for his own consumption, he has to depend on the leftover crumbs. So, for producing food, the upper caste or the elite section of the society needs the help of the Dalits, but after that, they are um, disregarded in every way. Okay, so what is more helplessness than those episodes of Dalit history is that when they are termed as the most evil beings in the natural world. So sometimes even the Dalits are treated as evil beings in this natural world. So she even questions the scarcity of water for Dalits because they are barred to reach the sources of clean water. And most often they have to carry to their homes the contaminated water of buffalo baths, urine, and bullshit. So this is the miserable condition of Dalits, and you can see she addressing all these problems in her poetry. And when you talk about her style and attitude, she resembles with that of African American poets like Arna Bontemps. So her major influence is black poetry. In some other poems, Kandasamy directly employs the African American vocabulary to twist the norms of established language. And besides her literary influences are writers like Derrida, Toni Morrison, Arundhati Roy, Kamala Das, and early Salman Rushdie until he started becoming absolutely formulaic. And she has written poems on various subjects, but the subject of caste overwhelmingly emerges as a conscious consideration in her writings. And she may be living a secure life in an emancipated and educated circle since she is a PhD holder and she's a writer. But in reality, she's not able to forget the Dalit women poets. And she often stood for Dalits, their life as a bondage for their basic needs and even a question of their survival. So she always stood for them through her work. Yeah. Now let's get into the analysis of a poem, Mulligatawny Dreams. Now, before analyzing the poem, let's see what is Mulligatawny. Uh, it is the origin of this word is Tamil, as you see. Um, this is a combination, this term or this word is a combination of Tamil words, milage, which means chili, or milagu, which means pepper, and tanni means water. So, Mulligatawny means milagu tanni, which means pepper water. But the dictionary meaning, that is according to Merriam-Webster, the meaning of this word is a rich soup, usually of chicken stock seasoned with curry. I repeat, a rich soup, usually of chicken stock seasoned with curry. And this is a soup originated from South Indian cuisine, that is Tamil Nadu. And this was very popular in British India by the end of the 18th century. And by 1800s, this began to appear in cookbooks of the day, with each cook featuring their own recipes. Okay, and the later version of the soup included British modification that included meat. Okay, and the early reference of this term in English goes back to 1784. And in short, you can say that this term is related to the soup rasam. Okay, you're familiar with rasam. Yeah. Now, let's see what is this poem about. Now, let's go through the first stanza. In the first stanza, you could see a list of words, yeah, which includes 5 lines. Okay, so you must be wondering why the poet wrote a list of words which has no connection at all. But you should understand that these are the words or these are the contribution of Tamil language into English. Now, before talking about these words, I just want to talk about the Tamil script, Malayalam script, and Hindi script. Okay. Now, just imagine how many letters are there in Tamil language. Have you ever thought about that? Yeah. Tamil script consists of 247 letters, which is 12 vowels, 18 consonants, one special character, which is neither a consonant or a vowel, and an additional of 216 1/6 combinant letters. So, Tamil script consists of 247 letters. And now, when you take Malayalam, there are 56 letters traditionally, but 51 letters are in use, which consist of 18 vowels and 38 consonants. Now, when you talk about Hindi, in total there are 52 letters. That is 44 vowels. 44 means 11 vowels and 33 consonants, and other words, that is other 8 letters include combined consonants, then aniswara and affas and binary consonants, etc. So total it becomes 52 letters. And now, how many letters are there in English alphabet? Yeah, 26. So from this, you can understand the richness of Tamil language. So it's said that number of Tamil words in the dictionaries all over the world include 1,24,405 words. So Gregory James, a professor with the Language Center of Hong Kong University, believes that more than 100 words in the Oxford English Dictionary have Tamil origin. Yeah. And the third edition of Oxford English Dictionary, published online since 2000, contains approximately 4 lakh words. And you can see that the word Anna, which means brother, was added to Oxford English Dictionary in 2017. In November 2017, Minister for Tamil Official Language and Tamil Culture, K. Pandiraja, inaugurated the list of 9,000 new Tamil words, apart from 4.7 lakh unique words in the dictionary. Okay, so this is the contribution of Tamil language into English. Now, the list of words you could see, that is anaconda, which means snake; candy, you know, it is sweet. Then cash means money; kattamaran means tied wood. Okay, cherut means roll. Then kuli means, you know, potter. Corundum means ruby. Okay, and you know what is curry, ginger, and mango. It's a name of a fruit, and you know what is ginger, and you know what is curry. Curry means gravy. Then mulligatawny means herb water or soup. Okay, then pacholi means green leaf. Then you know what is papadum. Then you know what is rice. Here tati means potato. Teak means tree. Then vetiver means an aromatic root of grass. Have you heard about pultailam? Yeah. So these are the words which are of Tamil contribution into English. Now, these words are borrowed directly from Tamil. Okay, and you know that Tamil is one of the most important Dravidian languages. And the speciality which you see in this stanza is that each word is differentiated or separated from the next word with a full stop. Okay, and also you can see that these words are arranged in the alphabetic order. Okay, but certain words with certain letters are missing as well. For example, you cannot find a word with B in between anaconda and candy. That is, there is no word with B, and there are no words with the D, E, F, etc. Okay, so with this, so here she points out the disorder in the order or the order in the disorder. So here she is trying to dismantle and disturb the very basic foundation of English language, that is the alphabet. You know, in English language, alphabet starts from A, then it ends in Z. Yeah, okay. And but here, for Meena Kandasamy, A stands not for apple, but instead it stands for anaconda. And it is assumed that this might have derived from the Tamil phrase Yani Kondra. Yani Kondra means that which killed an elephant. Yani Kondra or Ani Kondra. Okay, which means that which killed an elephant. So this stanza, that is the first stanza, recognizes the fact that there are considerable number of English words that have Tamil origin. And in the stanza 1, she demonstrates that this diversity and multiplicity of words, which are already the part and parcel of English. So, through this, she is trying to um, talk about or highlight the fact that, or she's trying to portray the contribution of Tamil language into English. Now, next, let's see. She is saying that I dream of an English full of the words of my language. So she is dreaming of an English which is full of her language, that is Tamil language. You know that culture and language are deeply rooted and they are intertwined. That is, without a language, there is no culture, and without a culture, a language does not exist. And this is the fundamental question in post colonial studies and literature. And also, cultural imperialism is also activated through linguistic colonization. And you know about Ngugi wa Thiong. Okay, he is the world renowned Kenyan writer, and you all know that he turned away from English to his native language. And this is also a part of post colonialism. Yeah, and on the other hand, you can also see writers like Salman Rushdie, Raja Rao, Kamala Das. They advocated for the nativization of colonial language with an aim to redefine the language in their own linguistic and cultural frameworks. So, to hit back the colonizers, that is British, okay, what did they do? They used English as a medium of resistance or protest. And you can see Meena Kandasami's Mulligatawny Dreams contributed to this second tradition of resistance to linguistic colonialism. She's using English in such a way that she's distorting its structure, its grammatical rules, its way of usage, etc. Okay, and she denounces the standardization of English and embraces nativization and hybridization. Okay, here I would like to quote Kamala Das. Okay, I quote uh, Kamala Das says, "The language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its cureness, all mine, mine alone. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is as human as I am human. Don't you see?" So, this is how Kamala Das uses English. So, it's in the same way that Meena Kandasamy is using English to localize or to nativize and hybridize the uh, language. So she dream of an English full of the words of her language. Now she talks about an English, that is an English in small letters. So here she appropriates and just see the whole poem. You cannot see a letter with capital letter. Every letters are in small letters. Every word is in small letters. So here she appropriates capital letter English to small letter English, and that is the fundamental in the post-colonial condition. She recognizes that language does not have an independent existence from its socio-cultural and political context. And she also promoted the use of more localized lexicons, means localized terms. Then she fused words, and also new coinages can be seen, and neologism taken from their own social cultural context. Now, for instance, writers like Arundhati Roy intentionally played with English according to the rhythms and syntax of the vernacular language, as you see in God of Small Things. And likewise, Kandasamy recommends for a deliberate remolding of English by inventing new words and styles through nativization and hybridization. And she's trying to decentralize and decolonize this colonial language, that is English. Now, she is trying to think of an English that is full of words of her own mother tongue, that is Tamil language. Okay, and an English in small letters, an English that shall tire a white man's tongue. Now, what does she mean by an English that tires a white man's tongue? Okay, so far you saw that not a single capital letter is used in the entire poem. And she says that capital letters generally signify the centralization of power and authority. Okay, so when we are using capital letters, it shows the centralization of power and authority. But here she longs for a language that can decentralize power and democratize the process of communication. Okay, and that she says that you cannot see a capital letter in Tamil language or in Malayalam letter. All the letters are of same font. Yeah, but in English you can see capital letters, small letters, etc. So she wants to break it down. in order to centralize its power and authority. Okay, and to make it more democratic. And not only that, it has been shockingly revealed that Dalits or OBC students are facing hurdles in the way of getting educated, uh, especially in the way of getting education in the medium of English language. And according to Meena Kandasamy, in one of her interviews, she says that the reason behind this is, I quote, English represents an inner circle of power and privilege that for a variety of reasons remains inaccessible to a particular group of people in India, specifically out of the reach of lower income and lower caste groups, and push them into outer circles. I repeat, uh, English represents an inner circle of power and privilege that, for a variety of reasons, remains inaccessible to particular group of people in India, specifically out of the reach of lower income and lower caste groups, and push them into outer circles. Uh, she says that the high caste policy makers are deliberately barring or banning downtrodden people from learning and speaking English because they don't want to lose their monopoly. So, Kandasamy acknowledges in one of her interviews that she chose poetry consciously because it deals with language, and language is the site of subjugation and oppression. So it is poetry which has the power to challenge the oppression of language and its inequalities. And the only positivity that existed with Kandasamy is her command over English language. Because from childhood she was studying in an English medium school, and she was using English for her studies. So she had command over this language, and that was her power. Now, here I would like to quote Gugiwa Thiong's words in his Decolonizing the Mind, in his work Decolonizing the Mind. He writes like this, I quote, language as communication and as culture are then products of each other. Language carries culture, and culture carries, particularly through orature and literature, the entire body of values by which we perceive ourselves and our place in the world. Language is thus inseparable from ourselves as a community of human beings with a specific form and character, a specific history, a specific relationship to the world, unquote. So language is very, very important for communication. So when you use a language, obviously there will be the influence of our culture as well. So this is what he says about language. Now in this poem she talks about an English uh, that shall tire a white man's tongue, and where small children practice with smooth round pebbles in their mouth to spell the right ra. You know that for the native English speakers, it's very difficult to pronounce certain Indian sounds like ra, re, etc. So it is a challenge for English speakers, and such words will tire the white man's tongue. Okay, and this is what she wants. She wants to make them powerless by giving or by presenting them with such tough words, uh, which are very difficult for them to pronounce. Okay. Now, again, you can see she dreams of an English where a pregnant woman is simply stomach child lady. And when you go through the dictionary, you'll find that the word pregnant means filled, charged, or heavy. Okay, she doesn't want to use this word. Instead, she wants to use a simple word, that is stomach child lady, a woman who is carrying a child in her womb. So very simple, in a very simple way, she wants to say, instead of pregnant lady, she wants to say stomach child lady. Now this reminds us of Nizam Ezekiel's linguistic style and choice of words, which he contributed into the canon of Indian English vocabulary through the poem Goodbye Party to Miss Pushpa T.S. So here Meena Kandasamy is trying to subvert and localize the English language, and she attempts to bring the cultural codes into her dream language in English. Now, again, in this part of the poem, Meena dreams of an English where the magic of black eyes and brown bodies replace the glamour of eyes in dishwater blue shades and the airbrush romance of pink white cherry blossom skins. Now, I know you all are familiar with advertisements. Okay. When you take an advertisement, for example, say Fair and Lovely, okay, that advertisement of Fair and Lovely, there you find a person who is fair, who might be wearing pink color. That is, the light shades or the pastel shades are always referred to as English color. So, and it said that these magnify their beauty. So she wants all these system or all these traditions to be uh, written off. And she wants the magic of black eyes and brown bodies, which means she wants Indians with their what to say brown skin or wheatish color or chocolate color to be recognized, and she wants them to be considered with the way they speak of their language. And she wants an English where love means only the strange frenzy between a man and his beloved, not between him and his God. So she implicitly argues that in the language she longs for, love means not mortal, mechanical, and money bound relationship between a man and his car. Instead, there will be an uncontrollable, eternal excitement between a man and his beloved, which is devoid of his possessions, which is devoid of his wealth. So, pure love, that is what she aims for. And again, she dreams of an English without the privacy of its many rooms. Now, the privacy of its many rooms can be referred to the grammatical rules and regulations in using the correct English. Now, she rejects the concept of correctness and she confronts the authoritative and hegemonic nature of language, which renounces the diversity and multiplicity. So, she is trying to break away from such norms, from grammatical rules, and from the correct use of the language. And now, when I was talking about her poetry in the beginning, I told that many people criticized her poetry for its language, for its theme, etc. So at that time, she defended, or she defended her poetry by saying that she writes for her people. She writes in a language which through which she wants to talk about her people, and it's for her people, and it's for them, and it's about them. Okay, so that's what she is trying to say about an English language. So here Meena Kandasamy is dreaming of an English that is devoid of all the fantasies. She wants an English language through which she can portray the reality, the realistic condition of her people, of the Tamil culture, or in particular. Okay. Now, again, she talks of an English with suffixes for respect, an English with more than 36 words to call the sea, an English that doesn't belittle brown or black men and women, an English of tasting with 5 fingers, an English of talking love with eyes alone. Now, here, Meena Kandasamy anticipates a language which will challenge discrimination based on gender, race, caste, and class, and she propagates equality and justice. and she aspire for an English with suffixes for respect. You know that in Western linguistic tradition, there are no certain words for respect. Okay, all are addressed as Mr. X, Mr. Tom, Miss Linda, or Mrs. Linda, etc. So everyone will be addressed in the same way. But in Indian languages, in most of the other Indian languages, including Tamil, there are suffixes as horrific like mar in Tamil and g in Hindi. Now, terms with respect in Tamil are like avargal or ayya for male, then amma or for female, ammini for lady in rural dialect, and thiru as respect for men, selvi for unmarried woman, and tirumadi for married woman. Even you address elders or seniors like annan, and when you're talking about elder ones, if she's a female, you'll call akka or amma for mother and appa for father. So here in Indian languages, especially in Tamil language, there are so many terms with respect which you cannot find in an English language. So she wants an English with suffixes for respect. And another important thing which she talks about is an English with more than 6 words to call the sea. In English, you have a sea, which is a large water body. Other term is ocean. Then you have lake. Then you have river, pond, which is very small. Uh, uh, so these are certain synonyms for water bodies. But in Tamil alone, okay, for there are 221 synonyms for the word sea, which starts from like kadal, aralai, alai, uh, uravanir, tirai, neer, etc. So there are 221 synonyms for the word sea in Tamil language. So she wants such a language and an English that doesn't belittle brown or black men and women. So, as I said earlier, she talks about an English where people, men and women, are not belittled based on their color. Okay, instead, they should be acknowledged based on their command over the English language. Now, another important thing which she talks about is an English of tasting with 5 fingers, an English of talking love with eyes alone. And you know that in India, eating with fingers is part of our culture, okay, and it is considered more primal and natural, okay, but foreigners may view this custom as uncivilized and uncultured. But there are certain reasons why we use 5 fingers while eating our food. Okay, now according to the Ayurvedic text, it teaches that each finger is an extension of one of the 5 elements. That is, you have 5 fingers, the thumb, which represents Agni, that is fire, it aids the digestion. Then the forefinger, which means Vayu, that is air. This is according to Ayurvedic text. Okay. And the middle finger, that is Agash, that is ether, the tiny intercellular spaces in the human body. And the ring finger means Prithvi, that is earth, and the little finger is Jal, that is water. Here, according to the Ayurvedic text, each finger aids in the transformation of food before it passes on to internal digestion. Now, gathering the fingertips as they touch the food stimulates the 5 elements. Which are the 5 elements? That is fire, air, ether, earth, and water. Okay, Panchabhutas, you know that. Okay. So these are stimulated and invites Agni to bring forth the digestive juices. Now, apart from improving the digestion of the person, it becomes the human being or the person becomes more conscious of the taste, the textures and smell of the food they are eating, and this aids to the pleasure of eating. So that's why we use our five fingers while having our food. And apart from all these, the most common benefit of eating with one's hand is that you'll be able to verify the temperature of the food you're eating or you're swallowing before you put it into your mouth, so that you can avoid burning of your mouth in case the food is too hot. Okay, so this is the I what to say the um, reason behind the usage or the tasting of food with five fingers. So in short, the science behind having food with hand and tasting the fingers are: one, it improves immunity, then it improves the sensitivity to bacteria, it aids good digestion, and it also increases our appetite, improve enjoyment in eating, and improve gratitude. And I'm sure as a small kid, or even today, when your parents feed you food with their hand, you feel it more tasty, right? Than having it with a fork or a knife or a spoon. So this is the science behind tasting food with five fingers, and this is uh, an uncivilized practice by the Westerners. They consider it as uncivilized, but this is very important and relevant in our culture. Okay, and she talks of an English of talking love with eyes alone. Okay, um, okay, so she talks about pure love. Okay. And finally, I dream of an English where men of that spiky, crunchy tongue buy flower garlands of jasmine to take home to their coy wives for the silent demand of a night of wordless, whispered love. Now, um, in um, in a Western culture, you don't find men buying garlands of jasmine flower. Instead, they give bouquet. They give bouquet for their girlfriend or their partner, but they never ever buy flower garlands of jasmine for their shy wives. Okay, spiky, crunchy tongue. Because their pronunciation is very um, odd for us. Okay, for us Indians. Okay, now when you talk about the flower garlands of jasmine, in Indian tradition, flowers play an important role, especially in Tamil culture. In India, offering flowers to the gods serves as a symbol of their love and devotion. And it's also found that in the 17th century, for the first time, the secret messages were conveyed through flowers. Okay, not only that, Tamilians divided their land into five natural geographical areas, and they gave the name of dominant flowering trees to each area. Now, the first one is Mullai. Okay, Mullai means it's a variety of jasmine and it stands for the forest area. Then there is another flower which is Kurinji, that is a mountain flower. It blooms from buds once in 12 years, and that stands for mountain region. Then you have Marudam, a tree with red flowers, and it stands for pastoral region. Then you have Neithal, Neithal, a water flower, and that stands for sandy seashore. And then the last one is Palay, an evergreen tree growing in arid areas, and that stands for arid land. So, jasmine stands for the forest area as well in Tamil culture. And apart from that, another unique feature of Tamil culture is that they wear different flowers in the battlefields to denote different activities in the battlefields. And there is no other culture which wore flowers when they went for war. Okay. So, in short, Tamil men and women, both Tamil men and women wore flowers. Men had flowers on their ears, women had it on their head. Okay, heads. And you can see many women in Tamil Nadu fastening a string of jasmine flowers to their hair, as it is considered as a symbol of good fortune, love, beauty, or even sensuality at times. And besides that, the white colors symbolize purity and sometimes modesty. So that's why you find every woman walking around with flower garlands on their hair. Yeah, in Tamil Nadu especially. So whenever you go to a market, or whenever you board the bus, or whenever you go to a temple, you see women who have worn jasmine flower on their head. So this is their culture, and this is the reason behind using flowers by them. Okay. Now, so she is dreaming of an English which is embedded with Indian culture, especially Tamil culture. She wants such an English. So, in short, throughout this poem, she's trying to appropriate English into local and cultural context of India in general and Tamil Nadu in particular. The image that she drew in the final stanza is very unique to Indian culture. Okay. And the language which is envisioned by Meena Kandasamy transmits the cultural marking, which are inseparable part of the poet's self as a Tamilian and the collective cultural self of the society in which she lives. You know that she lives in London, but she is full of her memories or full of thoughts of her culture, and she talks for Tamil Nadu. So, in Mulligatawny Dreams Altogether, by highlighting the multitudinous of native culture and by advocating for the infusion of indigenous metaphors and phrases, she challenges the dominant modes of misrepresentation and reconstitutes the language of power and writes back to the sender. Thus, this poem is an outstanding attempt to decolonize the colonial language. So let's sum up our analysis. Through this poem, she advocates for the nativization of colonial language with an aim to redefine the language in their own linguistic and cultural framework. As I said earlier, she advocates for the localization and contextualization of English. And in the first stanza, she exhibits this diversity and variety of words which are already the part and parcel of our language, English. And in the consecutive stanzas of the poem, she describes the characteristics and traits of the English in her dreams. Okay, she wants an English that behaves like Tamil with no capital letters and hefty Tamil imageries. She evokes the spirit of the land. Now, she presents Tamil as a language full of twists, eccentricities, beauty, and romance. Now, she challenges the dominant means of misrepresentation and reconstitutes the language of power and writes back to the sender, as I said earlier. And in this poem, you could see the politics of power, dominance, and colonialism are undercurrents in the which occupies a no man's land between uh, Tamil and English. And she says that these are not distorted towards one caste or one economic class, but it reinforces the political narrative. And here, language becomes a metaphor for the psychological and behavioral nuance of the people who speaks Tamil language. Now, as pointed out by the Nigerian author uh, uh, Chimamanda Adichie, English literature is full of people with blue eyes and golden hair. Now, she asked, what about the sweeter skin shades of brownies, caramels, and dark chocolates? Okay, so in the universe, summoned by Mulligatawny Dreams, this poem, love is frenzy and tongues are crunchy. Now, here in this poem, in the words of the poet, uh, Tamil in spirit, English on the tongue. This is how Meena describes herself. Now, she refers to her own use of language as Tamil English, that is, Tamil in spirit, English on the tongue, and tries to reflect that hybridity in her writing. So, on the whole, she's a well-read female poet who is in her 30s, and she writes mainly about caste, love, and society. And she is well aware of her past, and her poetry is rooted in reality, and that is the reality of her Dalit self. She may be removed thrice from the mainstream social paradigm for being a female, a Dalit, and a Tamil, but she compensated it all with the gift of her poetry and her usage of English. Then she also offers her resistance through language. Now, she's very much conscious of her being a Dalit and a feminist, and she thinks that writing in English has a power to reach the corridors of power and gain a wider audience. And to conclude, she dreams of an English which is free of white man's sway and from the control of elite society. And with this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you.